Hi guys, my name is Mr. Lead, and today we're going to be working through the topic of ecology. More specifically, we're going to look at certain aspects of ecology. We're going to look at food webs, as well as the cycling of matter and energy. Now, you're going to find that these aspects of ecology really strongly relate to the idea of sustainability. I'm going to come back to this in sustainability at a later point. Firstly, let's get a few definitions and terminology out of the way, because biology is all about that. An individual refers to one organism. Populations refer to an entire species in a given area. A community refers to all the species, all the populations of all the different organisms in a given area. And an ecosystem refers to the biological factors, the abiotic factors, biotic and abiotic factors, and the interactions between these factors in a given area. Okay, so with those definitions out of the way, let's first look at food webs. A food web represents communities. So remember, that's all the populations in a given area. It represents how a food web can represent the interactions between different populations in a community, and it shows us what eats what. So some things to remember with food webs. Firstly, there's a difference between a food web and a food chain. There's a chance you might have heard of one or both of these before. A food chain references just one sequence of organisms that feed upon each other, whereas a food web shows all of the populations in a given community that feed on each other. Some other things to note with food webs. You've got to remember the types of diets of animals, the trophic levels of animals, as well as you've got to remember the directions of arrows and that food webs start with the sun. With these last 2 points, it's important to know that the directions of these arrows, when you draw arrows in a food web, they need to go from the first organism to the second. They need to be going in this direction because the arrows show the transfer of energy. Okay, the energy of this waterweed is being transferred into the carp as the carp eats it. And so that's why food webs always start with the sun, because the sun is the original producer of the energy for ecosystems. More on that later. But firstly, types of diets and trophic levels. People get these two terms confused all the time. So to clarify, these are types of diets. You've got herbivores, omnivores, carnivores, detritivores, decomposers, and also autotrophs. Autotrophs produce their own food. They use this photosynthesis equation. They use carbon dioxide and water and the sun's energy to produce food and have oxygen as a byproduct. Those are types of diets. These are trophic levels. Trophic levels refer to where an organism is positioned in a food chain or food web. So if they're at the start, they're a producer, and the producers are all autotrophs. Then you've got primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. And then you've also got decomposers. And decomposers, what they do, they can break down dead organisms, all of these organisms, once they die, they break them down and leave nutrients behind for producers to feed on. Without decomposers, we would have really poor soil, nutrient deficient soil that producers would really struggle to grow in. To understand decomposers and detritivores and the difference between them, a decomposer is a plant or a fungus or a microorganism that lives on decaying organic matter, just like detritivores, but the way they digest these decaying organic matter is they have to release enzymes, secrete enzymes outside their body to decay outside their body, and then they ingest the nutrients. Detritivores, on the other hand, they do all of that internally, just like us. They have to engulf detritus, which are dead particles, and they ingest it and digest it internally. So some examples of detritivores are like snails, worms, millipedes, and crabs. These are all these can be consumers depending on how varied their diets are. But yeah, that's the difference between decomposers and detritivores. If you're a bit unsure of If this clashes with something you've learned before about decomposers and detritivores, just know in terms of terminology, some scientists are going to say that detritivores are different to decomposers, like in this case, but other scientists are going to say that detritivores are a type of decomposer, and the other type of decomposers are called saprophytes. Whichever type of terminology you subscribe to, just know that we have these two types of organisms that break down dead matter and leave behind nutrients. Okay, that brings us to our full understanding of food webs. Now we're going to look at the cycling of matter and energy. What you've got to know about ecologists is that they probably see the world a bit more, or see an environment a bit more objectively than what we would. So, for example, they would see this tree as a collection of matter. They would see the soil and dirt as a collection of matter. What I mean by that, let's take us humans as an example. Us humans, we are made up of different types of matter. We're made up of oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen and nitrogen. We're made up of a collection of different elements. Now, scientifically speaking, matter cannot be created out of nothing. That's not possible. This pen, for example, it probably has some carbon atoms in it. It's not possible for me to just magically make this pen duplicate or just create more carbon atoms. You can't just make more carbon atoms appear for this pen. If I were to want to make this pen bigger, I need to get carbon atoms from somewhere else and transfer it into the pen. Matter is always transferred. Okay? So the carbon atoms that once existed in this pen originated from, say, minerals or somewhere else. And once this pen becomes dust, those carbon atoms will then be transferred to a new location. The same can be said for us. The carbon atoms and oxygen atoms and everything that exists in us originated from somewhere else. Those atoms might have first come from, say, our mother. They might have come from the food we've eaten. And even those atoms would have come from somewhere else beforehand. So, keeping in mind the fact that matter can be transferred, bear with me on this idea. The objective view of an ecologist, the biological world helps transfer and cycle matter. So, the carbon atoms that were once in this plant is now being transferred into this fish, and the carbon atoms in this fish is now being transferred into this bigger fish. The biological world makes it so easy for matter to be transferred. Otherwise, we'd be having it to do it artificially so often, like say how machines transfer matter to make pens and other things. The biological world just does it so naturally. Matter can also be lost in waste, say through respiration with carbon dioxide or through the waste you produce, and matter can also be lost in death, your corpse. It will just be a pile of matter that will then be decomposed, and that matter will then go on to another place. The main example that we can use when we look at the cycling of matter is how carbon is cycled. So carbon is, the summary of how carbon is cycled is the carbon cycle. Carbon is transferred through this carbon cycle. So we can look at how carbon that was once in these trees can then be moved on to be carbon inside animals and consumers, which can be moved on to carbon inside decomposers, which can be moved on to be carbon inside soil. That can end up eventually to be carbon back in the atmosphere. Now, here's the important thing to note when we talk about the cycling of matter. Whatever type of matter we look at, there needs to be a delicate balance of where that matter exists. So say, for example, as we see in this finer illustration here, vegetation has a set amount of carbon. But if we take away that vegetation, that carbon will just remain up here in the atmosphere. If you take out one of these links in the carbon cycle, that has repercussions. There is a perfect balance to the carbon cycle. And that balance is facilitated by the biological world. The nitrogen cycle, that's another example of how matter is cycled. The nitrogen cycle, I'm not going to explain too much about it, but basically that also involves a lot of with decomposers breaking down nutrients. If you have too much nitrogen in a certain place, that's a bad thing. If you have too little nitrogen, that's also a bad thing. So once again, the nitrogen cycle shows how you have to have a perfect balance of where matter should be. The water cycle, that's another example of matter that gets cycled. Now, matter is not the only thing that the biological world helps transfer and helps cycle. The biological world helps transfer and cycle energy. Just like matter, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. Energy is only ever transferred. So we can see that as we touched on before, we can see that in food webs and food chains. Energy is that once existed in a producer gets transferred over into a consumer, which gets transferred into the secondary consumer, tertiary consumer, and so on and so on. And it all starts with energy that's from the sun. So that you are never able to create energy. You need to get your energy from somewhere else, usually just the food you eat. We need energy to live. This is the formula that shows how we get energy. We convert it with food and oxygen to create carbon dioxide, water, and energy. And so we need it for our body to produce body heat. We need it for kinetic energy, so for motion, and we need it for growth and repair. So if we look at how energy is used up overall in an ecosystem, a lot of energy gets kept and held onto by different organisms. So this producer uses up some energy, and then this first-class consumer will then consume some of that energy. But this first-class consumer needs that energy for heat and kinetic energy, as mentioned before. So by the time we find the second-class consumer, and by the time that this guy consumes this guy to get his energy, he's actually getting less energy because this first-class consumer has already used up some of that energy. So each trophic level will only retain about 10% of the energy from the previous trophic level. All that other energy is lost through heat or just being used up. I'm saying the word energy a lot. But we can see a food pyramid here can help illustrate how productive an ecosystem is. When you have enough energy being transferred, when you have the ideal amount of energy being transferred through an ecosystem, then you can see that life is well supported. One last thing to note about food webs. They help summarize the interactions in an ecosystem. So what I mean by this, if you were to take out one organism in a food web, say we took out this dragonfly, that has repercussions. That would mean that the animals that eat the dragonflies, so the frogs, there'd be less of them, but there'd be more of the animals that the dragonfly ate. And so that has even further repercussions. So say, for example, because there's more flies, then there's now going to be more turtles, and there's going to be less snakes because there's less frogs. There'll be the kingfisher will be alright because they'll still be eating these guys, but there'll be less trout now, which means there'll be less of these guys, which means there'll be more of these food. You get the picture. Food webs help show how, and they help point out the predators and prey, and how when you take out a predator, that affects the prey numbers. If you can see that just one little change in an ecosystem can just affect the entire balance and create a totally different looking ecosystem. The only exceptions is for ecosystems that are more diverse. The more animals that are in an ecosystem and the more different species that are in an ecosystem, the less susceptible it will be to change, because taking out one organism will just be so insignificant. Okay, so this brings us full circle, back to the idea of sustainability. Sustainability can be defined as the avoidance of the depletion of natural resources in order to maintain an ecological balance and suitable living conditions for a community. So for an ecosystem to be able to be self-sustaining, to be able to sustain itself, it needs a reasonable supply of substance or matter necessary for survival and growth, such as water or nitrogen. It also needs an input of energy and a wide range of species living inside that ecosystem. So we have looked through all these things by this point. We now know that if you don't have a reasonable supply of substance and matter, say, for example, if your carbon supplies are unreasonable somewhere within the carbon cycle, or for example, if your nitrogen supplies are unreasonable somewhere, then you're not going to have a self-sustaining ecosystem. Likewise, if an ecosystem doesn't have an input of energy, or if it's not biodiverse enough, then it's not going to be self-sustaining. Ecologists use models like food webs and the carbon cycle to help understand how an ecosystem can be self-sustained, and to help understand how we can make an ecosystem sustainable. Also ensure that an ecosystem is perfectly balanced. Thanks for watching.